On page 85, we're in the second part of the evolution and natural selection unit. We're looking at this idea of natural selection and diseases. How the things that cause diseases, especially in humans, can be an example of natural selection. Disease can act as a selecting force so that the organisms with the best adapted phenotype survives. So it's this idea that sometimes diseases are selection forces. They pick who gets to survive. So we want to talk about some human diseases, and we call them pathogens. Disease-causing organisms are pathogens. We have viruses, bacteria, protists, and fungi. So there are four main examples of pathogens that we're going to talk about. Pathogens will trigger an immune response. An immune response is going to mainly produce antibodies that tag the disease. And so when we have an immune response, this is when our body tries to defend us. And so if you get exposed to a virus, a bacteria, a fungi, or a protist, your body is going to recognize that it doesn't belong. And your body is going to try to defend you. And one of the most important things are antibodies. Please notice this is very different from the word antibiotic. Antibodies are proteins that tag the disease. And the important thing about tagging is both that can help destroy. It's kind of like putting a tracking device. An antibody is going to be a tracking device. So we know where it is, and that can help us destroy it. But it also, I'm going to write over here, can help us recognize again later. Recognize again later. So, we can be exposed to pathogens and our body will try to defend against us. Sometimes humans lose the battle with disease, and so some people will die from some of these diseases because their immune system wasn't strong enough. The immune system responds in a couple of ways. There are two types of immunity. The first is called passive immunity. Now, immunity here is going to be where antibodies help prevent disease. This is different than genetic immunity. For example, a bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics, that bacteria would have genetic immunity. We're talking about immunity with these antibodies. So passive immunity is when you are given the antibodies. And so next to passive immunity, we want to write given antibodies. And the good thing about this is that it's quick. But the bad thing about this is your body did not make it. In active immunity, your body actively produces the antibodies, and therefore you can remember the foreign invaders and help protect for next time. So active immunity is where you produce or make the antibodies. We can give you a vaccine where we give you weakened or dead viruses or bacteria. We can give you a vaccine and it will trigger or start, remember trigger means to start, the production of antibodies. So if we give you a vaccine, then we're going to expose you to a tiny little bit of the pathogen, enough to get your immune system making the antibodies. Remember, the antibodies help protect you against it. And so if you're given a vaccine, you get a tiny bit of the virus, your body starts to understand how to fight it, and the next time that someone exposes you to it, you're already protected. So the human papilloma virus, the HPV virus, we can give people tiny bits of the HPV virus, and their body will now know what HPV looks like. So that if you get exposed to HPV during a sexual encounter, your body would actually be able to attack HPV so that you would never, ever actually get sick from it. Now, vaccines only work if the virus doesn't mutate often. So that's why we can't have vaccines for everything, because some viruses mutate really quickly. The key point from here is that diseases can act as a natural selection force. I expose a whole room of people to a virus. Some people might die and some people might live. And that's a natural selection force. The people who live are the people who were able to prevent the disease or protect themselves. Now, we can sometimes give you the antibodies, but I want you to remember this thing. If you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man how to fish, he'll eat forever. So if I give you the antibodies, you'll be protected for a short period of time. But if I teach your body, next to active immunity, let's write teach body to make antibodies. Now the word is a little confusing because it's not against your body. Antibody doesn't mean against your body. Antibody means against the pathogen or disease causing. So we could give you the antibodies or you could make them, and if you make them, your body will remember them. The virus that we want to focus on is the human immunodeficiency virus. Please notice that this is the name of the pathogen. HIV is the name of the pathogen. AIDS is the name of the disease. So it turns out that AIDS and HIV, the pathogen and the disease, are a huge selection force. They can kill people, and a lot of people. And so we've been doing a lot of studying about HIV. Now quickly, viruses are not living because they do not have a cell. All that they have is what's called a capsid. It's this outer protein, and inside they have either DNA or RNA. So viruses aren't living, and they need to invade your cells in order to survive. And so the HIV virus actually attacks the T cells. T cells are the fighter, part of the immune system. So one of the sad things about HIV is that it actually attacks your own defense system. So this is why it's so dangerous, because not only is it not being damaged, but you can die from lots of other infections. So HIV is a virus. It has a protein coat, and inside is RNA. One note about this RNA is that RNA viruses mutate faster. So when we're studying natural selection, we notice that this disease, AIDS, is actually one of the natural selection forces that have affected humans. 10% of the European population is immune, and here we want to write genetically immune. 10% of Europeans actually have a mutation. It's called the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. So these people in Europe, they're mutants, but that mutation actually protects them from HIV. See, HIV has to bind to your cells, and if they have a mutation in the place that binds, then HIV can't bind to your cells. And that's how we see more natural selection, because the people who are genetically immune, they don't get HIV, and they're the ones that would get to survive. People who inherit 2 copies of this mutation are immune to HIV. And so you can see this picture here. This is the HIV virus, and it has to bind to this receptor. When it binds, then the virus is able to come into the cell and reproduce. As the virus reproduces, it actually will infect more cells. And people who have a mutation do not get HIV. Antivirals are used to treat AIDS and other viruses. The antiviral is supposed to block the introduction of viral DNA and RNA into the cell, or interfere with it being spliced into the host cell, or interfere with assembly of the new virus. And so we can use medications. Antivirals are medications, but guess what? When we put a medication out there, some of these viruses are going to be genetic mutants. And some of these viruses don't get affected. Now, if you need to press pause so that you can copy that, you can. We're almost done with this section. Viruses do mutate at a blinding pace, causing some antiviral drugs to be ineffective. Viruses like HIV randomly mutate. Sometimes these mutations will help the virus evade or not be harmed by the drug. So that virus gets to reproduce and pass on their genes. And then all of a sudden, those viruses are all resistant to that drug. So this is why HIV patients are usually on a cocktail of several different medications to help compensate for the quick mutations. So what we see in this section is that diseases like AIDS can be selection forces. They can force some people to be survivors and other people to die. But medications like antivirals can be selection forces too, selecting which viruses get to reproduce and which viruses are harmed. So it is important to be able to understand this example of HIV as a natural selection force. We're going to stop here